welcome to episode 85 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in breezy Napa Valley.
Breezy up there, eh? Sounds nice.
It is nice. I think it's not too much of a concern, but breeziness up here is often fraught with fear over fire danger.
I see. Is that the branches hitting power lines or just the fact that it spread so quickly?
Both.
Both. All right. Covered all your bases.
Any spark can cause an issue. It's in California, at least, it is wildly early to be worrying about this, but as we've seen in Los Angeles and San Diego, it can pop up at any time of the year now, it feels like.
Yeah, especially when people are setting them, as we've seen.
Yes, I saw that too. That's concerning.
Good times. Well, listen, take care of yourself, and if it keeps happening, maybe you just move down to Los Angeles with me.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I felt like that was a long shot.
I like Los Angeles, lived there for a long time, truly enjoy the city, but I don't think it's the best place to raise a young daughter.
I'll try not to take that personally.
I don't know what that means.
It's not because I'm here that this is a bad place to raise a daughter.
That's right. It's not because of you.
Okay. I'm just having Dave withdrawals, man. I haven't seen you in, 18 months probably?
It's been a long time, and also you and I haven't really talked much recently because you've been on vacation. How was that?
I have been. I'm not having family withdrawals. I've gotten my fair share of them. But yeah, it was nice. 8-9 days through the desert with mom and dad and an old friend of mine. It was really lovely, man. Got to see Vegas and Flagstaff, the little observatory, Meteor Crater. We hit the Grand Canyon for 2 or 3 days of hiking, a spontaneous skydive, which I know you were jealous of.
No, I cautioned you against doing it and then frowned at you when I heard that you had.
Well, you should have cautioned me against paying the guy extra so I could steer the parachute, because we missed the landing zone by about 200 yards and came down in an absolute heap with him on my back. So I had 3 or 4 days of discomfort.
This just doesn't sound pleasant to me, so I think I'll be passing on that experience in the future.
We were halfway through the free fall, and he said, "This is going to hurt." And I was like, well, all right.
Was he on a microphone? Is that how you were able to hear him? Or would he just scream in your ear?
He was on my back with, a loud voice in my ear.
Weird.
Yeah, it's surreal, but it was fun. We did a helicopter through the Grand Canyon, Sedona, which was incredible, man. I loved Sedona. It's real hippie, which, I have mixed feelings about. Everybody there's got a crystal. Energy vortexes and all that, but it's just stunningly beautiful. We did a hot air balloon rise at sunset one morning. Or sunrise one morning.
Go on that?
He landed us right into a shrub tree, which was unintentional but hilarious.
I think you need to stop going up in the air.
Every minute of this trip felt like danger, impending doom. But we survived it. So there you go.
Well, I'm glad of that.
Yep. Even won a little money in Vegas at the Cromwell, your spot. Coming
Love
back
the Crom.
Mm-hmm.
By far my favorite casino there.
That's because no children are allowed inside.
That is actually about that.
That's their tagline: adults only.
I like the Crom because it's smaller, and I have gambled there enough that I actually got to a point pre-pandemic where I knew a bunch of the servers. And so that was kind of cool because you just didn't have to really think about a whole lot.
Yeah, it's always nice to see a familiar face in Vegas.
Yes.
But yeah, it was a good trip. I in terms of the mileage, I hiked more miles than I slept in hours. I'll put it to you that way.
Also, that doesn't sound that attractive and pleasant to me.
8 nights, and if I cracked 20 hours total of sleep, I'd be shocked. But this is what you get.
Ask what you're up to.
No, sadly, I was just up to time zones. I was traveling with 3 East Coast people, which, when you travel in a group, democracy by default. So they were waking me up at 5, 6 a.m. and trying to crash at 10 p.m., which obviously I was having none of. So it was just all kinds of awkward, but, we made it.
At least you had fun, and now you're back, and you can get to enter yourself back into the LSAT world.
That's right.
But before we reach that point, now that you're back, what are you drinking?
I'm trying to rehydrate from all this desert time. I'm drinking a Hawaiian beer, or at least I think it's Hawaiian. Kona? You familiar with Kona, I think?
I've heard of Kona.
Yeah. I had a few in my fridge. A Big Wave Golden Ale is what I've got here. It's delicious.
Don't they do longboard too?
They do. Yeah, that's the longboard company.
Nice.
And a handful of others. What about yourself?
I'm also drinking beer. I'm drinking Pacifico, one of my more favorite beers. to grab every once in a while. You don't often see it around, but out in the West Coast, you see it a lot more. It's a very refreshing beer to me.
Yeah, I like it. We ate a lot of Mexican restaurants. We were traveling through Arizona and Nevada, which I had to continually remind my parents the pronunciation of. But yeah, there were several Pacificas consumed. I endorse it.
Agreed. So what's since you were just in Arizona, what's our music choice?
Yeah, you let me take the reins on this one too. One of the things that we did as we were traveling through, and God, did we travel, is we did a bit of Route 66, getting our kicks. And we passed through a little town called Winslow, Arizona, which is known, as far as I'm concerned, for one thing only, which is a line in an old Jackson Browne song that the Eagles adopted. Take it easy. Standing on a corner in Winslow, Arizona. Such a fine sight to see. Yeah.
He wrote the song. He didn't make a recorded version of it, though. It was just the Eagles who did the recording, right?
I believe there's a recorded version that Jackson Browne did. I don't love Jackson Browne, so yeah. I don't know, mostly out of indifference.
You know, he's one of those artists that I'm not a fan of, but when you listen to kind of like, especially people from the 70s who were big stars, they often speak with him in terms of reverence. Like they love what he was able to do, and I just never really connected. It's not melodic enough for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, he's a folk hero in the way that a lot of guitar players worship Frank Zappa and things. Or he's not everybody's cup of tea, but...
He's not my cup of tea, for that matter.
There you go.
There's a ton of people like that. I mean, I'm not a big Dylan fan or Patti Smith or any of those types of artists. So.
Fair enough. But there's a little memorial shrine almost on a corner in Winslow, Arizona. We had lunch in some Pacificos, I think, there. And there's a statue of Don Henley, and 10, 12 yards away, a statue of Jackson Browne.
That's odd. I have not seen that.
Yeah. If you're ever thinking about a destination in Arizona, I'm not sure Winslow would crack your top 10. But if you just happen to stumble through, have a drink and marvel at how small Don Henley and Jackson Browne are.
Is it life size?
I'd hope not. I'm hoping it's like, 3/4 replicas, but they were teeny tiny little guys.
That would suck, man. Hey, they made a statue of you, but it's 2/3 scale.
Yeah.
Like, no, make my statue bigger.
Make me like David, where I'm 14 feet tall.
That's right.
Anyway, that's been my last week and a half. It's good to be back. But given how out of touch I've been, maybe you take the intro to the LSAT world.
Well, the interesting thing about this time of year, it's almost like a throwback. Last year was crazy because we were dealing with the onset of the flex, but most years, this time period is kind of low key, and that has certainly been the case here. In the last week or two since we last talked, there really is not a whole lot going on. The first thing is, of course, the June LSAT is still approaching us, and that's coming up in the middle of June. Less than a month now, June 12th. They'll do Saturday and Sunday. I expect they'll add Tuesday as well. I'm not sure what other days they will add. They usually do Wednesday or Thursday for kind of like the accommodations testing, paper and pencil testing, things of that nature.
Right.
But that information won't be released until probably around 10 days prior to June 12th.
Yeah.
So that's coming. Probably, John, for you and I, the main event that's coming up is that next Tuesday, a week from today, we are going to do the Crystal Ball, where we will talk about the June LSAT, and I am certain that's going to apply to the August LSAT as well. So that is Tuesday, May 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Those are always fun. They always feel a bit like martyrdom. There are a lot of work. There's a lot of demands and expectations that come along with these things on the two of us, really squarely on our shoulders.
Yeah, and I think we've got some interesting tricks up our sleeve. I think we're going to get into some predictions that should be a little more specific. One thing I will mention is that when we say it's one night only, we do mean that. There will not be recordings sent out that relate to this event. So if you sign up, and it's free to everybody, you need to be there. There will not be a recording thereafter. We may post something in our online student centers for our students, but we're not going to send out kind of like the general posting that we've done in the past. So just be aware of that. If you get a chance, though, we'd love to have you there. And like I said, everybody's welcome. You don't have to be one of our students to be in the room, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's a little unusual. People who are used to these from the past have, I think, felt very comfortable skipping them because they know they can always just review it days later, weeks later. Not this one. So if you want to hear what we have to say, you better be there.
Be there live. And, the way to sign up for that is if you go to our website, you can go to powerscore.com/free seminars is one long word. You can sign up for the Crystal Ball. There's also a bunch of other seminars that we have going on a regular basis. We usually have something every week or every other week that is floating around. We talk about logic games, reading comprehension, and then occasionally John and I show up and say, let's start talking about this LSAT. And that's what the Crystal Ball is going to be, where we're going to predict what we expect to see on this test, and then maybe get into a deeper discussion of some of the tests they might pull from, things of that nature.
Yeah, I've got some inklings. We'll see.
Yes, you do, and so do I.
We'll see what you have to say. I know you have some as well. So that'll be a fun reveal here in about a week.
Yes, it will. That'll be a fun night. But other than that, John, that's the LSAT world. It's kind of like low key. This is mostly the admission season to me. I get a lot of messages from students right now looking at waitlist, at least as far as law school applicants. One of the things that has just kind of like come out now is the double and triple and multiple deposit list has been apparently accessible to schools. And so we've been seeing some interesting little messages floating around. Michigan sent out a note saying something to the effect of, you need to make a decision. We are happy to help. We want to know what your status is. And I'm seeing a lot of weird things just this year. A lot, I guess the word I would use to describe some of the stuff that I've read, both from our admissions consultants who I talk to frequently, as well as students that I talk to, is just the weird beseeching nature of so many of the requests. Like at Georgetown, the dean recently came out, and I guess he was talking to at least one student, if not more, and was like, well, tell us how much money you need, to really go here, like really trying to lock it down. And this follows on the heels of a number of requests from Georgetown and other schools saying, let us know if we're your first choice. We really want to know, which I think is a terrible question to ask people because what are you supposed to say? Oh, I really don't want to go there. No, you're always going to end up saying it's their top choice because there's some scenario like that. But this has been a strange admission season. Will be happy to see the back of it. It's been rough. I think what I'm seeing out of the depositing report is that it looks like there were more people double deposited and multiple deposited perhaps than in prior years as they wait for this really slow waitlist movement to release. They're hoping, well, I got into Michigan, but maybe NYU's going to let me in. And so they're waiting, and they end up depositing at a couple different schools.
Yeah, as a guy who just came out of Vegas, it feels like a poker game where no one's quite sure they have the winning hand. And so everybody just kind of keeps just checking, basically. Checking bets, and everything gets stalled. It's a tedious way to play.
Well, and the financials have been a little slow this year at times too. And so that leaves people kind of like high and dry as to, I don't know what to do. And so they want to play both sides of the fence. I actually support that. I'm 100% behind the students in this. If that's what you need to do, do it. Law schools play all sorts of games with like wait lists, reserve wait lists, holds. You have to protect your interests. And so for me, it's all about what is best for the student. And if depositing at two different schools is in your best interest, do it. There is nothing that says that you cannot do that. They're not going to love it if you're still doing it in like late June or July. So be aware of that. But and they'll be able to see it at a certain point and as I mentioned, that is now. So just be aware of how it works. But I think it's something, if you need to do it, you should do it.
I'm glad you bring that up. Yeah, I was just about to say, this is no time to be self-conscious about self-interest. You have to be your own best friend in this. Whatever it takes. Be ruthless, be cutthroat.
And it's really forward-looking advice. Everybody who's double deposited is already double deposited for this year. But if you're taking the LSAT with the intent of applying this fall, be aware that you may find yourself in this position next March or April. Absolutely. That's when you can think about these things, because all of a sudden you're like, wait, is this an option? Yes, it is.
It's great advice, man. And something we've covered a lot, so I don't feel we have to get too much deeper into it. Let's instead, and this is what I'm looking forward to, let's finish up a conversation that we started in the last episode, where we began talking about causality, really the nature of causality in terms of how it works on the test, some central assumptions and faults that authors who are dealing in causal conclusions tend to commit themselves to. This is going to be an opportunity for us to round that out, really bookend it, by talking about where you tend to see it in terms of common scenarios of causality. And that to me is exciting because we've gone from the principle to the practical.
Yeah, theory to application.
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah, in the last episode, we talked about, well, what is the central assumption of basic causality? How do you recognize it? How do you figure it out? And we really focused on basic causality when it's quite clearly stated, and you run to a lot of conclusions where the author is like, so this causes this. That's nice, and you want to be able to recognize that during the test. But one of the things that's equally helpful is to understand how that principle interacts with various question types. So I think what we should do is kind of like run through some different question types and talk about how the causality would work and what you should do with it or what you should expect in relation to that form of reasoning appearing in the stimuli.
I love it. And this is more than just accuracy, too. I mean, a lot of this conversation gets into issues of speed and efficiency. If you can recognize what's happening in the context of where it's happening, you know exactly what to do. That type of precise anticipation, that type of accurate prediction, that's the dream on the LSAT. It's what we preach constantly, but this is going to be a conversation that really demonstrates it.
You know, the way I would analogize it is this. Have you ever been driving in your hometown and you end up behind somebody that is clearly a visitor? And they don't know what they're doing. They might be going really slow. They might not know which lane, that they're in. And all of a sudden it's like, you're in a right turn lane. And then they're trying to get over to the left. Given where I live, which is a big tourist destination, and John, you and I, when we lived in Charleston, we saw this all the time.
I honestly thought you were going to say an Ohio license plate in Hilton Head, South Carolina.
That's another
what
one.
I could see what you were picturing.
You were thinking for a moment about all the Ohio license plates trying to navigate the traffic circles in Hilton Head.
Yeah, it's like the cicadas that are coming out. There's cicadas that are coming out this year, except the Ohioans show up every year.
Some people don't know this, that John and I, and where PowerScore was originally located was Hilton Head. And so we spent time there. Then the company moved to Charleston, and then John and I moved to the West Coast, him in Los Angeles, me in San Francisco. But we spent a lot of time in tourist destinations. And tourists in the summer in Hilton Head have to deal with traffic circles, which are great if you know how to navigate them. And a lot of tourists don't. Anyway, back to my point about how this plays into LSAT preparation. Everybody's been in that experience where you're behind somebody and you're frustrated. You're like, speed up, you're in the wrong lane, you don't know what you're doing. That's, to me, the person who goes into the LSAT who doesn't prepare properly and doesn't learn about this. If you don't know causality and how it actually interacts with these question types, you're the lost tourist. And by comparison, if you're a person who understands how causality works and you understand the interaction with each question type, you're the local. Yeah. You know exactly where you're going. You're like, don't speed up here. This is a speed trap. Or watch out. That's a right turn only lane. All these kinds of things. You have that knowledge and you have that sure-footedness as you navigate the scene. And it's kind of a hilarious, far-fetched comparison, but to me, it is really accurate because when you watch someone who doesn't know what they're doing, they are slow and uncertain, going fast in the wrong places and slow in the wrong places.
Yeah, that's right. And again, you can become the ultimate local, which to me is a London cab driver.
The knowledge.
That's right. So if anybody doesn't know what that is, we won't get into it, but I do suggest you look it up. It will impress you the next time you're in a London cab.
Yeah, that was a medallion that was worth like $100,000.
Something like that. I think it was 6 figures, yeah.
Yeah, it was powerful knowledge about the way they tested London cabbies.
That's right.
Knowledge.
You may not leave this conversation as a London cabbie, but you will definitely leave this much more well-informed as to how to react to causality in certain circumstances. So that's the goal. Where do we begin? Do you have a question type you want to start with?
I want to start with must be true. Okay. And really, it's kind of opposition cannot be true since they work the same way. What we would call the first family and the fourth family types of questions. But I focus on these because these are question types where the stimulus often does not contain a conclusion. Mm-hmm. So when you're given causality in these particular problems, it's usually given to you as just a matter of fact. Even if it is not, even if you are given a conclusion where they conclude that A caused B, or some type of causal relationship, the question stem is always doing the same thing in these problems. It's saying if the information above in the stimulus is true. And so, to me, this is a really interesting starting point because we talk so much about why causality is flawed, yet in both of these types of questions, the causality isn't flawed. Doesn't matter whether it's in a premise, doesn't matter whether it's in a conclusion.
Right.
You are forced into a position where you have to say, hey, you just gave me that information. I will accept it as fact. So even if they give you a causal situation, maybe they give you a correlation and then they say, yes, it turns out that A causes B, you can't question it in a must be true problem or a cannot be true problem. You just have to accept it and then use that to continue on.
Yeah, I've always found that to be, this might be a stretch of a word, but I've always found that to relax me a little bit. It's just feeling like there's this safe haven. There's solid ground that I can stand on. In the case of must be true or cannot, the stimulus is reliable, at least. And with causation in particular, something that is inherently unreliable, for them to tell you to believe it, it takes a little bit of the pressure off.
Yeah, and there's an old question from way back that's famous about Monroe eating things like hot peppers and sausages and subs and stuff like that, where one of the questions with that is it must be true. And it's like you just have to accept what's actually happening in there. And that's a weird moment for a lot of people if they've gotten used to weakening and strengthening, because you get into this thing where you see causality and you're like, there's a problem.
Right.
Not in those problems. And so it's an interesting moment when you realize that as you navigate through those questions, if you see causality, it's a beautiful moment. You just accept it and be like, all right, that's true, and just move on from there.
Yeah, and so you have to then think about what a causal statement ultimately proves. We'll talk a little more about assumptions with causality, but they, to me, rely on the same principle, which is that the relationship itself is, in fact, reliable. It's certain. You can trust that that cause does produce the effect came from it. They're not a correlation, they're not reversed, all the other ways that things can be inverted and disrupted and problematic. If they tell you it's a causal relationship and must be true or cannot, it is. And so then you have to think about what that guarantees beyond it.
Yeah, you get into an answer choice and somebody meets that causal condition.
Right.
You know automatically that the effect is something that they're going to experience. And you don't have to question it. You don't have to think, well, is there an exception to this? Nope. If they said the causality is 100% in the stimulus and there's some part of it that is met in the answer choice, you're going to have that relationship.
Yeah. It feels like a fairly self-evident point to emphasize, but it also tells me that if you don't really understand the question types, this is a classic point of doom for you, because your instinct is to question causalities, to challenge it. But in this case, you don't. So you have to know what you're dealing with here by question type itself.
Yeah, in this scenario, causality is your ride or die.
That's
you're going with them.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well said. But in the case of cannot, you think not about what it proves, but what it disproves. It disproves things like something else could have led to that effect, or that the effect could have happened without the cause, or that the cause could be impotent and lead to nothing, etc.
Yeah.
So,
some great questions with cannot and causality too. And it's really weird because, of course, cannot is a question type that often flips things on its head and is hard to wrap your mind around. But you go out and you find some of those questions and you realize pretty quickly, all right, I've got this trick now. You don't have to look at too many before the concept locks in. You look at like 3 or 4 and all of a sudden you're like, all right, if I encountered this again, I'd be in good shape. And if, especially the higher you're shooting on the scale, the more you want to be prepared for like these outlier events like that.
Yeah, I'm going to throw you a quick compliment. I feel you bristle already, but take it. Was that you framed causality and duality for me that was very, very useful. Both the opposite idea of must be true, the disproof idea, but the inversion of a weakened question.
Yeah.
Where the stimulus actually attacks an answer. And that to me was eye-opening, really game-changing, because it made those questions so much clearer to me. And I have you to thank for that, so thank you.
I'm happy to have helped.
We did an episode, at least in part, on causality, or on cannot, if anyone wants to go back and listen to it. We didn't touch on causality there, but it will, I think, be a bit revealing about the question type itself.
Yeah, it goes into the idea of that it's either kind of like a polar opposite must be true or a reverse weakened question.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Speaking of weakened questions,
I think that's where we should go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to go because this is the classic to me. This is where you can really learn about causality. In our courses in the Logical Reasoning Bible, I introduce causality and connect it to weaken first. In fact, the weaken chapter is right before the causality chapter in the Logical Reasoning Bible. And in the lessons that we do in our courses, the ideas are connected sequentially as well. And that's because it's so easy to understand where the problems lie. And if you think about these stimuli, remember what's happening is you're getting an argument. And that argument, when it deals with causality, is typically going to be something where the author concludes that one thing causes another. So it's really easy to spot. You'll see like, oh, these two things were happening. And then, geez, oh, the author's like, so that must be the way that it is. Really straightforward. To me, it's actually one of the tests that I often give people when they tell me they know what they're doing.
Right.
And you've seen me do this before, whether it's been online, on phone calls that I used to take. Somebody would be like, well, I know everything there is to know about this. And I'd be like, okay, tell me the 5 ways that are really the easiest 5 ways to weaken a basic causal relationship. And then for me, I always wait to see how fast they do it. And it's not that it's a speed test, although, of course, the LSAT is. It is that I want to see if they really do know it. If you stumble through it, then it's a problem. But if someone says that A causes B, we know there are a number of possible problems with that. The first thing is that it could have been that something else caused it, an alternate cause. So it wasn't A that caused B, it was C that caused B. You can also show scenarios where you have the cause present but no effect. So if I say that A causes B and then you show me a scenario in one of the answers where A occurred and B didn't, that weakens it. There's what I call the effect no cause scenario, which is another answer choice where they're like, well, here's the effect happening, but the cause didn't. That weakens it. Of course, it can also be reversed. It's not A that caused B, it's B that caused A. It doesn't always apply, but often it does.
Right.
And then the 5th way is to really question the data somehow, what we call data attack, to undermine the relationship by showing that somehow it's invalid from the information that they have.
Yeah.
Those 5 are really easy to talk about, but it's one thing to hear it, John, and then it's a completely other thing to actually absorb it and be able to know immediately. What I always tell students starting off is learn those 5, memorize them so you know what they are. Not every single answer is going to be one of those 5, but a lot of them will be. It'll give you a huge, quick advantage. Then over time, after you kind of like have gotten your feet wet with it, learn the ins and outs so that it becomes second nature and intuitive. And that's why I'll say, how do you weaken an argument? And I'll do this. I used to do this in the old days to Kaplan students. As they would call up and they'd be like, I'm not sure it's different. I'm like, let us have a conversation. And we'd go through this. I'd be like, you know about causality. Oh, I know all about it. I was like, how do you weaken it? And they'd be like, well, and they'd start giving me some half answer. And I'd be like, no, let's break it down. And then they'd be like, I see this is actually a different, more comprehensive approach. But you should be able to say to yourself, hey, I know the 5 ways. It's alt cause, cause no effect, effect no cause, reverse cause, data attack. And you should know exactly what each one of those look like and feel like.
Right.
That's being a local in terms of doing these questions and not being a tourist who's just kind of wandering through.
Yeah, and those, frankly, that's not just local. Those are your own neighborhood. That's your backyard. These things are just immediately recognizable if you know what you're doing. But they're so crucial. You and I did a 4-part series of these on flaws, and the first 3 of those 4 were all about knowing the categorical flaws that tend to reappear constantly. It's a little bit like that. If you know what a source argument looks like, or a false dilemma, or a mistaken reversal, you're covered, and they're free points. That, to me, is what this is in weaken. If you know these common ways to attack causality, and they are very, very popular, you're really golden for much of the weaken stretch.
I'll also point this out because, it can feel at times like, gosh, there's a lot to know and a lot to learn, and maybe I have to memorize a little bit. That's okay. Guess what? When you get to law school, there's going to be a lot more to know and a lot more to memorize.
Yeah, welcome to the choices you've made with your career, by the way. Welcome to law school. Yeah.
The reason this works the way it works is this. If I can know all this stuff beforehand, I have to think less during the test. That frees up that kind of mental energy to focus on things that are really, truly difficult, parsing out difficult senses and stimuli, understanding a relationship that might be really challenging. I'm able to operate using less energy and then save that energy to use it when I really need it. And so anybody who says, oh, don't worry about this, I'm like, you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. I'm going to run smoother and faster than you are because I just know more about the environment. I know the neighborhood. You don't. So I'm always going to be more precise and more definite.
I love it. There's 1,000 analogies that come to mind. Hybrid cars, an operating RAM, and et cetera, et cetera. But they all really boil down to the same thing. If there's things about this test that you can know are going to come up and that you can reliably prepare yourself to just instantly react to correctly, why would you not?
Yeah.
This is a gift. It's a gift the test makers are giving you, and you don't get too many of those.
Well, in each of the cases of these 5 categories, these are the 5 main ways that you would undermine an argument. And again, they, as we'll talk about at the end very briefly, they've added some wrinkles and variations to causality to kind of open up the door. But you can go into the history of the LSAT and find examples, numerous examples of every single one of these occurring. The people who make this test are at least semi-human. They will repeat themselves. They are going to sometimes just go to the path of least resistance and repeat concepts.
Yeah.
We know this. It happens. That's part of the standardization. So you have to know it beforehand. And I get mad when students are like, well, I don't know it. I'm like, somebody's failed you.
Yeah. Well, and that's frankly all it is. But end of the day, you've failed yourself. So know this stuff. So there's a sibling question type that goes right along with this, and we've just got to jump right to it, I think.
Totally. Because the beautiful thing is, I used to tell students, I was like, once you know how to weaken it, you do the exact opposite thing, and guess what? You strengthen it. So it was like, it's a 2-for-1 deal. It's the best sale of your life in LSAT terms. You learn those 5 ways of weakening an argument, and then just do the exact opposite thing when you get to a strengthen, or really, in most cases, an assumption question.
Right.
And you now have added all this additional information, and you're covered on both sides of causality, no matter what they do.
Yeah, a lot of bang for your buck here. So every way that we just talked about weakening causality, if you completely reverse it, if you think about the opposite of what that would be, so instead of introducing an alternate cause to weaken, you eliminate any alternate cause, and you have actually statistically helped that argument become more probable.
Yes.
If you could say that it would weaken to show the cause or the effect alone, then to strengthen an argument, you would do the opposite. You would show that they depend on each other by being coexistent or co-present. If you can weaken an argument, it's with causality by showing that the relationship could be reversed. In other words, almost throw the chronology of it into doubt. All you have to do to strengthen an argument is make sure the cause happened first. Eliminate the possibility of reversal. Or, finally, to strengthen an argument, you could shore up the data, reaffirm the statistics, show that some sort of survey was conducted properly, whatever it is that they have based the argument on, making sure the statistics actually check out a little more, that helps. All of those are common ways to strengthen, although I will say my favorite, and you're welcome to debate me, I don't know what your favorite is, if you even have one. My favorite is the idea of eliminating an alternate cause, because this is the one that is truly, in my opinion, creative, almost inventive.
Because they can eliminate anything.
Yeah, you have to imagine alternate causes that could have competed or could have been a problem, and then recognize what an answer looks like to deny them. That takes a little bit of out-of-box thinking. I like that.
Well, it also creates answer choices that might be talking about something that appears initially to be completely out of the blue.
Nonsensical if you
and
don't really
unrelated.
think
You're like, well, they didn't talk about that. It's like, right, but they're killing it off as a possible cause. And when you do that, you support the argument. That's a really tricky thing because they're saying you got to take the answer choices true in these questions. And so there's this idea of like, well, they were talking about this one concept. That doesn't even talk about the concept. It'd be like, in this world, when you're killing off an alternate cause, they can bring in anything they want. It may not even appear to be that closely related, and it could still support the argument if they take it, get rid of it.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that I often use for students, if you'll indulge me.
I will.
We've been talking about locality, mostly with navigation, but imagine there's some local restaurant that's really popular, and I say that it's popular because the staff is amazing, award-winning chef, or just all the waiters are super hot. It would actually strengthen my argument to say the food is garbage, or overpriced, or the portions are tiny. All of these would help my argument because I've argued for popularity from a different angle. Yeah. So if there's a competing thing, like, no, it's cheap, or the food's delicious, or it's, you get enormous Arizona-sized portions, what you would find is that those compete with my argument, which is that it's the staff instead. That's a really tricky thing to wrap your head around. But once you do, especially in higher level questions, again, it's a free point.
Yeah. It's a really good way of being a test maker and throwing people into a black hole of difficulty, because what they end up looking for is an answer they think is really close to what's being talked about, and they end up with an answer that's completely far away from it.
Yeah, it's sort of strength in the most roundabout possible way. But it works, and they test it. And where you tend to see this is not in question 3, but in question 19 or something. Don't anyone hold me accountable to question 19, please.
No, it's 19.
Oh, gosh. I won't make a prediction
19.
like that till the Crystal Ball webinar. Hint, hint.
Ooh.
Yeah.
We can talk about question numbers, though. That should be fun.
We'll see. But that, to me, with strength and a weakness side by side, like you say, you get a lot of bang for your buck if you know how this stuff works.
Now, if we're going to talk about strength, then let's slide right into assumption.
Fair enough.
As a question type. Because, to be honest with you, the assumption set really overlaps the strength set. It does work on the same idea. And that's because what's happened here is that the author said that A caused B, they had this belief that it was always perfectly related that way, and it was exclusive. So any possible threat, any of those things that would attack the argument, they have to be killed off. And that means the same 5 ideas that you saw in strengthen, such as like eliminate an alternate cause or strengthen the data, those would all work here on the assumption side. However, it's usually going to be something that's more along the lines of eliminating alternate causes, because that is such a tricky thing, as we were just talking about. Right. There are ways they can work out all the others as well.
We touched on this a little bit last time. What the central error, really, of causality is the central assumption of it. What do authors say or think when they observe an effect and claim a single, universal conclusion for it? And that is that they're perfectly exclusive. They're always linked. They cannot independently exist. And so what you see a lot of times, particularly in defender assumption questions, are answer choices that come in with negative language to deny a potential alternate cause. We just talked about that with strengthen, but in assumption, it is in fact necessary that every possible alternate cause does not compete, does not exist. And that's, again, a high-minded thing to think about. It also means it's a little unpredictable, Dave, which I think is what you were suggesting with strengthen. It can be difficult to predict what they might want to, and strengthen denies an alternate cause or an assumption, frankly.
You can't predict it.
Yeah.
In fact, there's no way to prephrase in this scenario, because they could choose from one of, potentially thousands, if not millions, of possible causes that they want to knock out.
I'm going to put one asterisk on that for you, if you'll, again, indulge me, which is that in strengthen, oftentimes the stimulus will present 2 causes and see the author commit to one. There's that classic case about the anti-smoking campaign versus the increased price of cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And they argue that it's the campaign that has caused a small decrease in smoking. What does the answer do? It denies the cost. Sometimes they'll telegraph it in strengthen, but you don't tend to see that in assumption.
That's a good point.
Thanks, buddy.
Now, just as kind of like a sidebar on assumption questions, remember, there are some really interesting kind of like scenarios that play out with assumption in general. And I know that you wanted to mention some of these.
I just think it's an interesting thing to point out. And again, I mean, if there's an underlying consistency, a theme even tonight, it's that when you can anticipate what the test makers are doing or are going to do, you're in the driver's seat. It's a position of power. And with a lot of assumption questions, you find yourself with scenarios or constructs where the underlying assumption of them is, in fact, quite predictable. Conditional reasoning, for instance. What the assumption there is that the necessary condition must, in fact, exist when the sufficient occurs. So a lot of times what the right answer in that case will be is just to reaffirm the relationship or to talk about the contrapositive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another one is historical change over time.
I love that.
Yeah, one of the ones that I was like, gosh, I keep doing this. If you've got a stimulus that's talking about, vastly different time periods or 10,000 years, one of the things is that all the conditions remain the same, that there wasn't external change or some kind of like unusual movement outside what you're actually talking about, as in it's the same environment now as it was 10,000 years ago. And that's a tricky one when you're not prepared for it beforehand. But there's a number of LSAT questions that have that type of assumption in there.
So many. And when you've seen a few and you see it again, it's so recognizable. It's one of the most distinctive things to encounter because you know exactly what you're dealing with. The one that I'm thinking of, you may have different examples, is the one about temperature tolerances, I think in Britain with beetles.
Yeah, that's probably the most famous example.
Maybe so. Where the ancestors of these beetles still live on these British Isles, and above a certain temperature, below a certain temperature, they die. So 10,000 years ago, it must have been within that temperature range for their ancestors to have lived there. Yep. And of course, the assumption. Thanks, buddy.
Good recall.
Well, you're just full of compliments today. I should leave for a week more often.
You really should. That'd be great.
And it ends. It was fun while it lasted. But the assumption of that is that the beetles' temperature tolerances haven't changed over that time span, of that gap of time. I love questions like that because, again, you just know immediately what they're going to do. You feel clairvoyant when you see something like that. Like, I know what's happening.
Yeah, and if you examine that question in isolation, you would think, okay, that's what they did. You don't necessarily think to yourself, well, that connects to a pattern where I can look at other questions, and it might not be about beetles or 10,000 years, but it's like, oh, something about dinosaurs now or asteroids or whatever. And you're like, oh, look, it's still that kind of continuity assumption is what I call it, where things stayed the same. Then you can start connecting this stuff. And that's obviously what we attempt to do when we're looking at questions and kind of link them back to the history of how they do this. But this is what turns you into a local in terms of doing these questions as opposed to just a tourist.
Yeah, dude, I really like that distinction. I'm going to use that more often.
I clearly like it. I'm using it constantly now.
See, now you're saddled up. I like it, though. It's great. Or one other, something we've touched on a little bit in some other episodes, but like numbers and percentages. Typically, the assumption that authors make when trying to compare a percentage to a number or vice versa is something to do with the total that the number is out over the percentage represents. Yeah. Same thing. But man, when you know how this stuff works and you see it happening, it's just instantly recognizable and you never even have to think, really. You're on autopilot.
It allows you to move faster and more precisely without having fear and uncertainty. And you can then use that information to find those answers more quickly. And then if something's really difficult, at least you now are like, I'm already past that. I'm to this point now. I can really focus on the difficulty and not having to climb the lower elevations of the mountain to get here.
I like that. Part of what this comes down to, too, and watch this transition, see if this is seamless.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, hold your money. Is a big part of this is how you describe things. We've been talking about how to really react to causality, how to weaken it or strengthen it or, discuss the assumptions inherent to it. But a lot of questions present causality and simply ask you to describe very often what it is that the author has done wrong. I'm thinking particularly about Flaw, but its sibling question, which is method.
Yeah, the way method and Flaw approach causality. Remember, both of these fall back into the first family, where you're just accepting what was said in the stimulus is true and then trying to determine the answer on the basis of that. If you are able to read a problem, and a lot of times with causality, there are flaws involved, so it's more often that it's going to be a flaw, but it could be a method as well. And you're now looking at the answer choices. Well, think about what they're going to do. They have to describe that causality in some way. And there are synonymous terms out there, but it is not easy to find too many synonyms for the words cause and effect. In the same way, it's not too easy to find synonyms for the words sufficient and necessary.
Right.
So when you see conditional errors and conditional reasoning, they often use those words. Here, when you see causal reasoning in a method or flaw question, a lot of time, not always because the synonyms come in there, you will see the word cause or effect or both. And if it's not something like effect, it's result, or outcome. Something that's like, that's what they mean. They mean effect, or, they mean cause by these words.
If they don't use cause, they might use produced, resulted in, led to, yielded.
Determined by.
Sure. Yeah. How long you got? Let's go all day. But the idea is obviously quite clear. If you're asked to describe something, the answer is inherently constricted by what you've just read. And if you've just read causality, they have to use that kind of language to describe it. So you can look for that with, again, I'll put a caveat on this, read the whole answer through. Just because they use those words don't mean they use them accurately. You may see a flaw that allows for an alternate cause and an answer describes a reversal of cause and effect.
Yeah, this is why we say read all 5 answer choices.
That's right. And
You
read them all the way
answer
to
choice-
the end, please.
Yeah, you read answer choice A and you're like, oh, it says cause and effect. That's the right answer.
Yeah.
But it's describing the wrong type of causal error that happened. Then you get to D, or maybe you didn't. And you're looking at it after the test and you're like, oh, D described causality too, and I just never looked at it.
Yeah.
No, don't allow yourself to lose an easy point like that. Read all 5 answers.
Yeah, people get into 2 risky habits with this, where they either play a word hunt and they'll just as quickly as they can scan for an answer that says cause, pick it, or they will pick the first answer that looks good and move on because they're scared about time. This is how you can actually read all 5 answers with a greater degree of efficiency and still be guaranteed to get it right.
Yeah, use the information to narrow the answers, but then double check and confirm that it says what you want it to say.
Beautiful. Yeah. You want to talk about a couple of other question types? One that is probably my favorite use of causality on this test. I know that's a strong thing to say, but it is resolve the paradox. It's maybe my favorite question type, which is why I give it so much love no matter what.
It's the fun question type.
Yeah.
Hey, there's
the life
a
of the
problem
party.
here. Fix it. You're a fixer when you
That's
deal
right.
with resolve. The interesting thing about resolve is, to me, if you look at how we classify questions, one of the things that you'll note is that we don't put causality in resolve questions. It's very, very rare. And that is because there's an actual feature of resolve questions where the whole thing's causality.
Mm-hmm.
Every resolve question is in fact causal, which is kind of like an interesting fact to encounter because most people don't think about it this way. What's happening in a resolve question? You get a stimulus, usually with no conclusion, where they're like, here's a situation, and now here's another piece of information that is in conflict with it. Oh my gosh, what's going on? You figure it out. Resolve, explain the discrepancy. Well, every answer choice that is correct in these problems is giving you a cause of how it could come to be, which helps explain why it in fact isn't a problem.
Right.
How is it? It can't be that way. Yes, it can. This would have caused that to happen. So all these correct answers in resolve problems are just causes that they are giving you. So the whole problem is, by definition, a causal exercise.
Yeah.
So it's kind of redundant to be like, resolve, it's causal. Resolve, it's causal as well. I'm like, no, they all are. Just let it go. So when you look at the classifications, automatically resolve is actually factored into that because all of them operate in that way.
That's right. Yeah. The right answer in your unimprovable phrase is that it will contain an active resolution. And active is the key word to me for causality, is that there's going to be some sort of productive force behind it. And of course, with resolve the paradox, resolution is pretty important too.
Yeah, that's an excellent point because I don't know that I've really thought about that too deeply before, where it's like we do talk about actively resolving the paradox in these resolve questions, and you think about the language of causality, it's all active.
That's right.
The cause makes the effect happen. It's an activator. It's doing this thing. It's a perfect parallel for why it actually lines up in this particular way.
Yeah, you could just as easily call it active production, where it produces both sides of the seemingly counterintuitive situation.
I could just as well call it causal resolution.
Oh boy. Well, we've got our work cut out for us. Some edits.
Not changing
Some
anything.
revisions.
No, that's too much work, man.
I agree. Forget we said it. But it is a good point. I do like that question type, and I think we cover it well. There's another one, and I don't know that we've done these in a particular order, but maybe some flow, if we're trying to establish it, is if we're going to tack on to the backs of things like method and flaw, we should probably talk about parallel. And this to me is the last great bastion for causation to exist. Because you see a lot of causality in parallel questions, particularly in parallel flaw questions, as you'd expect, given how much we've harped on the dangers of causal arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, continue? Okay. Proceed.
I mean, I'm happy to dive in
No,
because I love parallel questions.
I know you do, which is why I thought you were probably chomping at the bit, but no, out to pasture instead. Parallel flaw in particular, the two things I guess I would say to this, and I know you're going to probably add to both. The first is, if you know the common causal structures, you're going to be golden here. In the same way you can describe them well in flaw or even method, if you can recognize them, you'll see them in parallel, and you can simply go re-see them in the correct answer. It's a really fortunate circumstance, I think, to find yourself in if you understand causality when you see it in a parallel question. Because this, to me, is a complete time saver. This is how you skirt all of the minutiae that a lot of the wrong answers bog you down in. Does it have causality? Does it have causality? And you're good. If it doesn't, you can eliminate it.
We'll think about how we approach parallel reasoning questions, and we use the idea of, isolating elements, whether it's the conclusion or the premise, the nature of the language. The very first one on that list is there an identifiable form of reasoning?
Right.
Well, causality is an identifiable form of reasoning. So if you have that there and you can say that's what they've done, they've made a causal conclusion, yeah, you're now looking at A. Does it have it? Yes, no. B. Does it have it? Yes, no. And you're killing off all the loser answers, and then you can just look at the remaining contenders.
Yeah.
It's a hammer that you can strike against answers and just crush the wrong ones.
It really is. Yeah. It becomes a spot check of just simple language at that point. It's amazingly powerful. However, much like we put the slight disclaimer on flaw and method, just because they use causal language doesn't mean it's the same causal construct or the same causal argument. You still have to read and make sure you understand the architecture of it.
Yeah, you're likely to see a couple of answers that have causality in them. And one of them will actually match what's happening in the stimulus, but the other two usually be some kind of variation. Some type of different causality. Maybe one's reversed, whereas the other one's just straight, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
They won't quite match what you're looking for. So you still have to winnow your way through those contenders that you have. You can't just say, oh, the first one's the best one.
Yeah, and the same is true for something like conditional reasoning, which is probably the closest parallel here. Just because you see conditional reasoning in an answer choice doesn't mean it's the same conditional form. The stimulus had a mistake in reversal. This answer is a contrapositive. Those are demonstrably different. So, again, be careful, but this is a way to cut some corners, as it were.
That's exactly right. Anything to add on parallel?
Not on parallel, no. I do think there is another thing to say.
There's one. I'll say one more thing.
Okay.
So essentially, I think that covers the main question types where you're going to encounter causality, and kind of gives you an idea of really a roadmap for saying, all right, if I get this type of question and I've got causality, this is often the direction that they take with the correct answer. And this is, some of the ways they try to trick me. It does occur in other question types. You might see it in justify, but it's incredibly, incredibly rare because it's so hard to make a causal argument there.
Yep.
You might see it in something like evaluate. You don't see a whole lot of those questions anyway, so it's not something to really overly worry about. It's not that it's exclusively linked to just the question types that we talked about. They can do it anywhere. It's just that some question types lend themselves so much more easily to manipulating this type of reasoning. And those are the ones that we were actually talking about. So I think that kind of at least covers the idea of these are the main question types. This is what they're actually going to do with it. Agreed?
Yeah, I do. And that's a wide enough net that I think we've covered just about every possible circumstance of what I consider to be basic to medium causality.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that. Let's close with that point briefly, which is in the first kind of episode of this two-part arc, we talked about what the real focus was, basic causal relationships and the assumption of that. One of the things that's happened in recent years is that I think LSAC, it dawned on them. They probably read the LRB and said, oh, whoops, we're doing this. I don't think they had realized up until a certain point how they were actually presenting these arguments in such a highly structured and constrained manner. And so one of the things I started to see probably, about 10 years after the publication of that book was variations on the theme, where they started to say, well, let's not make it quite as straightforward. And what we've termed that is it's no longer basic. Basic is A causes B, no exceptions. It's really clear. It's absolute. And in the recent years, one of the things they've added, they still do basic. They do plenty of it.
It's the majority.
Yeah. They've added to it because they're like, uh-oh, we're predictable, and they hate being predictable. And so they've kind of thrown in this causality that is more advanced. And there's a couple things that you should at least be aware of with that. So we've been talking basic, other versions exist, but there are things like possible causes where they lower the language in the stimulus to say, hey, it may well have caused it. And when they do that, the validity of the argument is usually much higher, simply because that's not nearly as absolute. They might say, it probably caused it. There's weaknesses there, but still, they're not making it absolute. And that relationship, when you say A for sure caused B, that's such a powerful statement that it's usually easy to poke holes in. When you say it's probable, it's harder to poke holes in it, but it still can be done. And when you just say it's possible, usually it's really tough to kind of like disprove something like that because it only takes one instance to show that it's true.
Yeah.
So just watch for that language when you run into certain conclusions. The degree that they use of certainty makes a difference as to kind of like how valid or, questionable that conclusion is going to be.
Yeah. Any qualifying language on this test is critical to catch. The way I often think about it is, what would it take to disprove this? How many exceptions would I need? If I say something will happen, to disprove it, I just need one exception.
Yeah.
That's risky for me. If I say something could happen, to disprove that, you need every exception.
Yeah, it can never happen.
That's exactly right. I feel pretty safe with a could statement, and less safe the more extreme I get. And causality is no different. That's just language. Words. Yeah.
I'm having a funny memory that I'm not going to share.
I have no idea what that is.
No,
but
you
I
don't.
imagine it involved an ex-girlfriend.
No, it didn't. I think I was at a concert at one point, and I was like saying something. I was like, I don't even want to get into it.
Did it involve me? Well, just tell me
No.
this. Was I wrong in this memory?
No, you were not there.
I wasn't.
It was all about taking chances and whether or not you could see it. And my comment was, it's possible, you never know. And they were like, no, it's not. And I was like, that's going to be a hard thing for you to disprove. I didn't say it was going to happen. I said it's possible that it could occur.
I imagine it's you on a tour bus with Girls Aloud, but I'm going to leave it. It's possible. It's possible.
Let me just say this. You were correct. It involves Girls Aloud.
Oh, boy, that was a really good guess.
Most things in my life from years ago that were, super fun concerts involved them. Anyway.
Optimistic possibilities do for sure.
Yeah, I think, probably Cheryl Cole. Anyway, let's move to the next causal idea, which is, kind of backing it down from that basic causality. And that's where they start talking about partial causes. Mm-hmm. And multiple causes, where they say, well, maybe this contributed to part of it, or it was one of several different causes. And of course, in the real world, this is really normal. We often think about causality in this way. Like, yes, it happened, but there could be other causes. Sometimes on the LSAT now, they will give you scenarios where they allow for that language. Yeah. And then sometimes we're like, well, that didn't cause all of it, but it seems to have caused a portion of it. It had an effect of some sort. And that's the partial cause idea. So again, watch
a contributing factor kind of thing. Yeah.
Excellent. That's exactly what it is. Watch for that language, because when they do that, they are loosening up the constraints, and that gives them more latitude in the answer choices. It's not nearly as tight and rigid as the scenarios that we've been talking about with basic causality. Yeah. And then, of course,
go ahead.
I was going to say the last of kind of like the advanced causal forms is where they talk about increases and decreases in the likelihood, degree, and force of something. Where it's like it's going to cause something, but if you do more of it, it's going to cause it to get worse. Mm-hmm. Like eating ice cream may make you feel sick to your stomach, but eating a ton of ice cream is going to make you feel really sick. That kind of degree force is another thing they do now, where you didn't really see that in the early prep tests.
Like proportionality almost.
Totally. Yeah. Good way of putting it.
Thanks. Again, I've had a lot of time on my own to think about these things. This is how I've tuned out my family for a week, as I've considered what examples to give for this causal episode.
I don't believe you for a minute. I'm sure that you were fully engaged with the family.
They are untune-outable, unfortunately.
Your sister was there, right?
She was not, no. Me and an old friend who's a girl. I have to be careful how I phrase that. And mom and dad. My sister is growing larger in Nashville.
She's pregnant again.
Deeply pregnant.
Okay. For some reason, I was under the impression that she and her husband were along with you, so that their child was along there. And I was like, that must have been crazy for you.
No, I'd have come home the next day. No. You did say something a little while ago in this episode that reminded me of the kid. The existing kid, not the potential one, which was, you used the phrase, uh-oh, and I watched her on FaceTime the other day put her shoes on the wrong feet, and she looked at them, and she looked up at my sister, she looked at her shoes and goes, uh-oh. It just made me think, even at 3, accidents can happen, but a degree of awareness, if I'm going to try to make this in any way relevant, a degree of awareness of what these common situations are can clue you in when something's gone a bit off kilter, when the shoes are on the wrong feet or the author's doing something questionable, being able to recognize it's hugely, hugely valuable.
Yeah. And so our focus has been on basic causality and that high force, high absolute kind of relationship. But it's useful to kind of close out this discussion by saying, hey, there are other types. You've been
Right.
seeing a little bit of that in recent years. And so be aware of it. Don't just say to yourself, I saw the word cause, and so for sure it's this. Make sure you understand the context of what is being used. And then when you're studying out there, look for these questions and say, well, which group does it fall into? And if it's falling into the basic groups, be like, where does that fall on the spectrum of outcomes we were talking about? And if it doesn't, if it's in the more advanced side, stop and examine that, learn from it, and say, how did they manipulate this? What did they do that was different than I expected? That's how you get better at this test.
That's exactly right. Yeah, any degree of facility with this advanced stuff builds off the back of the basic. So if any of the things we've talked about in these last two discussions are a little unclear to you, focus on those first. They are a springboard into the more advanced forms that you start to see cropping up a little more often now.
Yeah, get the basic on lockdown, and then that allows you to start taking the advanced stuff and understanding that in relation to those basic ideas. That's the foundation, and it allows you to see the kind of superstructure they build on top of that.
That's exactly right. Perfect.
And on that note, let's call it a day, John. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and rating as well. And if you have any questions for a future episode, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of myself and John, we are out of here. We hope you have a great week. Take care.